Hi, I'm Deboki and this is Okie Dokie Boki, and today I am going to be reminiscing about the music of my youth, thanks to two very different but also kind of similar books. The first is Open Book by Jessica Simpson. The second is Meet Me in the Bathroom, Rebirth and Rock and Roll in New York City, 2001 to 2011 by Lizzie Goodman. For context, I am 30. I started listening to pop radio when I was like 10, so that was like the era of Britney and Christina and like I guess some boy bands too. And then I started listening to K-Rock, the radio station, when I was 13. So my teenage years were shaped by like a combo of indie rock and emo. So both of these books were really interesting to me because they're both centered around figures who were important to both aspects of my musical youth, but also like not necessarily central to it. Jessica Simpson is very much of that like early 2000s era of pop, and Irresistible is probably like in my top 5 list of songs to come out of that era, but she was not one of the like main successful pop girls, and her place in like the pop culture pantheon was really cemented more by her performance in the reality show Newlyweds, which helped launch like more of her career. Meanwhile, Meet Me in the Bathroom is a story about indie rock coming out of New York City and how that changed the landscape of rock music really globally in the 2000s. So the book covers a lot of bands, but the main band at the center of the story, like the one that is so vital to it that the whole book is named after one of their songs, is The Strokes. And I've always liked The Strokes, like I think their music is great, but for me personally, and the music that I look back on, The Strokes has like not necessarily been the enduring central figure. So that was actually like a part of why I was interested in reading this book, because like I had heard that it was so much about how important they were to that era of music, and I didn't know any of it, so I really wanted to learn about that. Jessica Simpson and The Strokes are not necessarily musicians you're going to talk a lot about in the same breath, but both of these books are really interesting peeks behind the curtains of like how the music industry works and how that shapes the careers of musicians who are working in different parts of it. It's interesting though because the scopes of these books are very, very different. Open Book is a memoir, so it is very, very focused on Jessica Simpson, obviously, and so a lot of the behind the scenes stuff that she's taking us through is unfortunately built on the very sexist stuff that we've come to expect, especially from like the corporate building of a pop star, especially like out of that era. You know, so she's like pressured to lose weight and to wear less while building an image around her virginity, and she's also constantly compared to the big stars, Britney and Christina. I did really love getting to see though how she talked about her contemporaries who she first met when she was really young, because they all auditioned for the Mickey Mouse Club, and it was just very sweet, but like also maybe a little bit bittersweet because their careers have all taken, you know, their own specific trajectories. But I think part of the sweetness is built on the fact that, you know, they've achieved a level of fame that very few other people are going to be able to relate to, and so I think like hearing her kind of perspective on them, even if it's very brief, I just really liked that. Aside from the music stuff though, a big part of the job of being a pop star is performing your relationships, and this was definitely true for Jessica Simpson's career. Her fame was built in part on her relationship with Nick Lachey, whose fame has been a little bit less enduring, but he was in 98 Degrees and then they were on Newlyweds together. And so that really made both of them famous, but Simpson more so than Lachey. And she goes into more specifics about the personal side of their relationship, both the good and the bad. And the end of the marriage marks a really seminal part of this ongoing journey that she's like describing that she's had over the course of her life, in terms of coming to understand like her relationship with herself and with others. This gets to its most toxic when she talks about John Mayer. As someone who has consumed a lot of celebrity gossip and who also think that Taylor Swift's song Dear John is like one of the best breakup songs of all time, like definitely one of the most vicious, this is a section that like really puts the lines from that song, "You are an expert at sorry and keeping the lines blurry, never impressed by me acing your tests," it really puts those lines into perspective. Simpson really digs into how he played on her self-worth, a worth that had been defined in the public so much more by her appearance than by her talent. And this connects to the business of it all, which in turn also connects to her family and how much she was basically the family business. Her dad, Joe Simpson, is kind of one of those figures from that 2000s era of gossip. A recurring thread throughout this book is the complications of him as like originally he was a preacher, but also like him as a husband, as a father, and like also later as Jessica's manager. She really doesn't shy away from showing the ways that his role as her father and as her manager really come into conflict, especially when he is pushing her to do something because he's coming at her life with the perspective of like someone who is trying to create the most profit profit out of it, whether it is for his own sake, for his family, for her sake, whatever it is, he's doing it at the expense of her actual well-being. Like, aside from John Mayer, Joe Simpson is probably the other grossest person in this book, and I've got a lot of questions about how he sees that. Like, I'm curious, like, if he does actually like feel bad about it, like, does he feel embarrassed, or does he like see this as part of like the reevaluation and repackaging of Jessica Simpson? I've got a lot of questions about that, and I don't know that I'm gonna like get any answer that feels good. Music and business and relationships is a recurring thread through Meet Me in the Bathroom as well, but the scope of that book is much wider. This book is an oral history. It's drawing from interviews with like band members, record label people, journalists, bloggers, like just a ton of people from like that New York City music scene in the 2000s. The book itself is a very New York book. Like, it does a lot of that like very stereotypical like wonder of New York kind of thing. And like, personally, as someone who grew up for a while in upstate New York and who lived in New York City for a very short period of time and whose parents live in Long Island, I would like to establish that I love New York, but I find this particular form of self-obsession so deeply insufferable. Like, especially like the first few pages have a lot of it. But once the book like kind of got over that and like actually delved into more of the specifics of the city, like different events and trends that actually shaped the rise of this specific type of music in this area, I found the book really fascinating. And there's a lot to get into. Like, obviously, for one, you cannot write a book that starts like in the 2000s, especially one that takes place in New York City, without describing the devastation and impact of 9/11. But on top of that, you have Giuliani's reign as mayor, the dot-com bubble, the rise of blogs, Napster, all of these things that made that decade so many different things, and that ended up shaping the city as well as the music industry. And because these are rock stars we're talking about and not pop stars, the idea of image and control is both very similar and very not similar to Jessica Simpson's experience. Image is important, and there's a reason why this scene overlapped so much with the fashion world, and the Strokes took on a very specific and ultimately influential look. But also, there is so much chaos to this world. Like, for one, there is just so much cocaine, and I am not particularly enchanted by drug use or extensive descriptions of drug use, so sometimes it began to feel a little bit excessive, but it also felt very honest. And I think at points, especially when you're talking about club culture and how that impacted the music that was being made, it is a necessary part of the story. The feeling that I had while I was reading the book is that it made me appreciate a lot of the bands that I grew up with a lot more, especially Interpol and the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, but it also kind of made me hate a lot of the people involved in that world. But like, I'm a reality TV fan, so I am well trained to be fascinated by the people I also find aggravating. What was tougher for me were the ways that this book felt like nostalgia for nostalgia's sake, which is based in part on the form. An oral history is just a collage of so many people's different points of view, and so the extent to which there is any analysis, it's mostly through structure. So like in the chapters that the author has chosen to assemble and to order, and then the juxtaposition of quotes that, you know, might interact or contradict each other in some ways, but the author herself offers very little analysis. The great thing is that rock stars are pretty upfront about their opinions and feelings, but they're also not particularly reliable narratives, and without an author to guide you through their thoughts, there are a lot of things left unexamined. And the most glaring omission to me is how it treats that very New York institution of gentrification. Gentrification is a big recurring part of the story. There's the gentrification of like the Bohemian Lower East Side by richer white people, which then sets the artists of that area to go off and gentrify Brooklyn. Except that there is very little acknowledgement that that is what's happening when the artists move into Brooklyn. There are multiple points in this book where someone will talk about Brooklyn like it was just this barren wasteland until the hipsters came in. The extent to which there's like any assessment of the ways that they were gentrifying Brooklyn, it's to briefly attribute it to like a lack of an entrenched artistic scene in Brooklyn to protest against this influx of people. To be completely honest, I don't know enough to argue with that, but I don't think that the book does either. After all, like according to this book, according to the people in it, the Lower East Side did have this entrenched artistic scene that did protest, but gentrification still happened. And again, the people in this book are frequently framing that as a loss of culture. But then in contrast, it uncritically frames this like gentrification of Brooklyn, this influx of the indie rock scene into Brooklyn, as a gain of culture, which is frankly, like the most gentrifying thing. And of course, the glaring omission from this discussion is any meaningful inclusion of race, and particularly the blackness of Brooklyn. While I was reading this book, I was also listening to season 3 of the podcast Slow Burn, which is about the deaths of Tupac and Biggie, a story that is very much woven into Brooklyn's history. And it's by far not the only part of Brooklyn's story, but it is one of the biggest cultural stories of the 90s, you know, the decade preceding the events of this book. And so it was just really jarring for the book to gloss over all of that, to gloss over what it means to think of Brooklyn, a place that has had a very significant identity and history and culture for a long time. And it's just not having that, and specifically how that relates to the majority whiteness of indie rock. There's a natural trajectory to this book built on familiar arcs you'll find in any story of celebrity, where aspiration leads to success, leads to excess, leads to broken relationships or failure, or some other toll that is collected eventually. But this book feels centered on its nostalgia and the sense of grit coating the surface of the rock world, that it's unable to deal with the grit that's actually built into the core of it. Open Book is built on nostalgia as well, but I think it's built on a desire to re-examine our nostalgia, and particularly our need to re-examine the toxicity of 2000s tabloid culture, which makes it more deliberate in a way that I think is also worth examining and maybe even questioning. Open Book got a lot of publicity because yes, it feels like an open book. Jessica Simpson opens up very deeply about her life, which includes sexual abuse, addiction, and intense scrutiny around her body. I was listening to this audiobook with my husband, who is not nearly as invested in pop culture as I am, and he was taken aback kind of by like how upfront she was about all of these different parts of her life. And I love this stuff because I think it's important to address what we often dismiss as like, you know, the dumbest parts of pop culture or the trashiest parts. The discussions I've seen following this book have been a lot of like reevaluating how we treated Jessica Simpson a decade ago, whether, you know, it's calling her stupid or fat or untalented. And you can trace those conversations to specific choices she makes and how to lay out her own story, which draws from headlines a lot of us probably remember, but she's giving us her own personal side to them. But while it may be marketed that way, I don't think this book is really fully aiming to be a celebrity tell-all memoir. If it were, I think there's a lot of other stuff we'd be diving into. But maybe that's just my own sadness and resentment over the fact that she didn't get into like one of the biggest pop culture stories of the 2000s, her sister getting caught lip syncing on SNL. If Meet Me in the Bathroom is unexamined nostalgia for nostalgia's sake, I think Open Book is following the other route and kind of taking advantage of our nostalgia and our desire to examine it. Now that it's been a little bit of a while since the release of the book, I'm kind of intrigued by the way that this book has helped Jessica Simpson reestablish her image in a way that is directly connected to her very literal brand. Jessica Simpson is not just a person, it's also a very successful clothing and lifestyle brand. And so I'm just very fascinated by how this book resets the narrative, not just about her life, but also about her business. To me, the juiciest gossip in this book has nothing to do with celebrities. It's just a very quick line about a detail that she had in her contracts, which she specifically credits with driving the success of her business. And honestly, I think I kind of want the Jessica Simpson contracts book. But also there are many moments in this book that feel like directly cribbed from the lifestyle blogger playbook, where she'll be like telling a story about herself and she'll be very vulnerable, and suddenly like it'll connect to like a very specific item or principle behind her business. A lot of influencer culture today is very much built on the same ideas that pop stars are built on, of creating a certain idealized image of femininity and domesticity and relationships to sell shit. And we also ask influencers to package their vulnerability in a way that gives them that sense of authenticity and connection. And that's a large part of what Jessica Simpson is doing here. Simpson talks in the beginning of the book about how she was originally asked to do a more self-helpy style girl boss book, and how she didn't really feel like she could do that in an honest way because she was still getting herself together. And all of that might be true, but I think she's also being really smart about the fact that her story is her most valuable asset, as is the introspection that she publicly applies to it. And that still actually kind of makes it like a self-help girl boss book. It's just hidden in a celebrity memoir that's very deliberate about what it's going to tell all about. Both Meet Me in the Bathroom and Open Book are books about nostalgia for me in a way that was like really fun. I looked up some of Jessica Simpson's old music videos on YouTube to like appreciate her voice better. I also rediscovered the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, a band who like at the time I didn't really know much beyond like, you know, maps until this book made me realize that their music was actually really fucking amazing, which I should have known because I've listened to Karen since then and I've loved her stuff. But these books were also reminders that part of getting older is realizing that that sense of nostalgia is every bit as much of a commodity as the music was the first time around. It's telling that nostalgia and music are like so often packaged together. It's like that is, you know, Urban Outfitters' whole business model. But of course, nostalgia is not just limited to music. It also extends to books and TV and movies. And it is also very good at making us uncritical. That's part of why Midnight Sun is so successful. Stephenie Meyers may have launched YA into what it is today, but like YA has come a long way since Twilight. So I don't know why anyone would care about like a poorly written, racist, regressive YA vampire series if it weren't for the nostalgia. But the fun of nostalgia is feeling like a kid again, of feeling like you're reliving, you know, that part of your youth. So it is tempting to fully indulge in that, except that of course, nothing we think we're reliving is actually being relived, whether, you know, it's the dance moves that you tried to learn when you were 10 or the Interpol album you listened to obsessively with a friend who you don't talk to anymore. You can't actually go back to that time and, you know, maybe we don't always even want to. Even the reinvented iterations of nostalgia, like updated 90s fashion or rebooted TV shows, will hopefully carry the hallmarks of change and maybe even progress since then. That change is part of the nostalgia cycle and it's probably for the best. I don't actually want a return to the like merciless world of 2000 celebrity gossip, and I'd really love an end to deifying assholes just because they can strum a guitar. Nostalgia is fun and it's wonderful, and you can pry my never-ending Sailor Moon obsession from my cold, dead hands, but nostalgia is not an objective reality, it's just a lens, and sometimes it can distort the ways we look at things if we're not too careful. So thank you guys for watching. If you've read these books and you want to talk about them or you want to reminisce about this era of music in pop culture and all of that stuff, let me know down below, and thank you guys for watching. Bye.